Hello and welcome to another Spurgos Thought for Your Day. I'm Pastor Jon from Sun City Church, and we're going to be continuing our series on the book of Psalms, looking at Psalms chapter 6. And my thought for you today is simply this, that the sun never stops shining. If you've ever suffered loss or felt the pain of grief in your life, maybe you've been wounded or betrayed or hurt by those closest to you. Perhaps you've found yourself at times in your life in that place of a very dark despair or depression and a sense of hopelessness. Then I know that you can relate to this psalm because David expresses the anguish and the pain that he's going through in his own life. And he describes it as weeping tears of speaking without saying words, of that feeling of numbness and speechlessness, to only be able to communicate your pain with weeping and groans. If you know what I'm describing, then you will understand and relate what David is writing in this psalm. So let's read it, a little bit of it together. Psalms chapter 6, starting in verse 1. It says that, "O Lord, don't rebuke me in your anger or discipline me in your rage. Have compassion on me, Lord, for I am weak. Heal me, Lord, for my bones are in agony. I am sick at heart. How long, O Lord, until you restore me? Return, O Lord, and rescue me. Save me because of your unfailing love. For the dead do not remember you. Who can praise you from the grave? For I am worn out from sobbing all night. I flood my bed with weeping, drenching it with my tears. My vision is blurred by grief. My eyes are worn out because of all my enemies. Go away, all you who do evil, for the Lord has heard my weeping. The Lord has heard my plea. The Lord will answer my prayer. And may all the enemies be disgraced and terrified, and may they suddenly turn back in shame." Well, David is in a pretty dark place at the beginning of this psalm, and we can see that by some of the terminology he uses. He describes himself as being weak, of being sick, of his bones. The very deepest part of him, his bones are in agony. He's feeling worn out. He's feeling like doing nothing but weeping tears, that he has drenched his bed with the tears that he has cried. And in verse 7 he uses this expression that my vision is blurred by grief. You know, when we find ourselves in such a very painful place, and grief can be so overwhelming that our vision literally becomes blurred. Our perspective on life is altered. And in fact, of the sorrow that we're going through, that sense of loss or despair that we're experiencing, can give us a false sense of reality. We fail to see that the sun is shining because temporary clouds have obscured it from our view. When we live in the shadow of storm clouds, we have to remember this, that the sun has not gone away. We simply can't see it at that time. In fact, the sun never stops shining, and it's always shining upon us, whether we see it or not. Even in the shadows of the darkest storm, the sun is radiating its light and warmth to the earth and is bringing life to each and every one of us. The fact that we may not always be able to see it or feel it doesn't mean that it's not there. The same is true with God. It's in the place of deep pain that it can be hard to feel or see God's hand at work. A common response to grief is to try and find some purpose or meaning or reason from what has happened. But the truth is that many times there is no obvious reason. Things in life sometimes seem to happen with no rhyme, with no purpose. Or the answer that we're given doesn't really make sense or is too horrible to contemplate. But despite those failings, that doesn't mean that the Lord himself does not see or feel what we're going through. In Hebrews 4 verse 14 to 16, the writer records these words. So then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe, that this high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all the same testings that we do, yet he did not sin. So let us boldly come to the throne of our gracious God, and there we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it most. In Psalms in chapter 56, David writes in verse 8 that you keep all of my sorrows, and you've collected all my tears in your bottle, and you have recorded each one in your book. So David had that sense that though he could not always see the Lord, he knew that the Lord saw him, the Lord recorded his sufferings and his sorrows, that he was not unmoved by his circumstances. When Jesus saw the grief and the loss experienced by Lazarus' friends and family, it moved him deeply. John 11 records in verse 35, the shortest verse in the Bible, simply says that Jesus wept. So we won't always understand or know the reason why. We won't always experience an instant answer to our difficulty. However, that does not mean that God is failing us or is too busy to respond to our prayers. It does not mean that God is not compassionate or does not care about our situation. But like David, there have been many times in my own life when I have felt surrounded by darkness, times of great weakness in my own self. Moments when I could no longer pray, when I felt numb, unable to communicate, and all I could simply do was put one foot in front of the other, to walk by faith and not by sight. You know, in those times, I'd like to be able to tell you that when I prayed, I felt the presence of the Lord, or I felt that the gates of heaven were open wide. But the truth is, in many of those experiences, it felt like the gates of heaven were shut firmly and that my pleas were bouncing off the walls. But I know that although I lived in the temporary shadow of the suffering I was going through, the sun was still shining. My eyes were simply blurred by tears at that time. And eventually, what I have experienced many times in my life is that the night will pass, and with its passing comes the dawn. In Psalms 30, in the second half of verse 5, it records, weeping may last through the night, but joy comes with the morning. And by the end of this psalm, David has experienced a shift in his perspective. He reaffirms his faith in God, and in verse 8 to 9, he declares that the Lord has heard my weeping, the Lord has heard my plea, and the Lord will answer my prayer. The dawn has begun, and the clouds have begun to part in David's life, and as they part, they reveal that the sun had never stopped shining upon him. God watches over you. God hears you. God sees you. Never be ashamed of your tears. Never be ashamed of your questions, and never be ashamed of what might seem as weakness and vulnerability. Because all of those things, our humanity forces us to trust in the Lord, to cast ourselves upon his mercy and grace. And that is why Paul in the book of Philippians wrote in verse 13 of chapter 4, for I can do everything through Christ who gives me strength. Remember, the clouds are temporary, but the sun is eternal. In Job chapter 37, there's a sentence. It says in verse 21 that we cannot look at the sun, for it shines brightly in the sky when the wind clears away the clouds. The wind will clear away the clouds. The sun will rise in the dawn. This temporary darkness will lift. The sun indeed has never stopped shining. So my word for you, my encouragement for you today is no matter how dark the day may be, no matter how overwhelming the emotions might be, we can come with all our vulnerabilities and weaknesses, with all our questions, all our mixed up emotions. We can come with all our tears, and we can come and lay them before Jesus, and we find that the sun is still shining. He'll blow away the clouds, the night time will pass, and a new day will begin. There's always hope. Thank you for listening, and may the Lord bless you.